World History presents Fall of the Third Reich, narrated by Sam Devereaux. Introduction. Hitler preferred death to flight. Adolf Hitler ruled Germany for 12 years. As the Third Reich began to collapse in on itself in the spring of 1945, the Führer took up residence in Berlin. By the middle of April, he'd entrenched himself in a bunker deep beneath the capital, as the Soviets bombed the capital around the clock. Eventually, even Hitler would have to face the fact that the war was lost. The Führer turned down all opportunities to flee, preferring instead to make use of both a gun and a cyanide pill at his doctor's suggestion, the surest way to kill himself. Hitler was only one among countless casualties in the war's final months. One of the war's worst air attacks cost thousands of civilian lives in Dresden, while in the Baltic Sea, a German refugee ship was destined to become history's biggest maritime disaster. Chapter 1. The Red Army strikes a decisive blow. In January 1945, over 2 million Russian soldiers head west from positions on the Vistula River and the East Prussian border. Stalin's taken the decisive step into the Third Reich and now targets the country's capital. En route, Russian soldiers will take a terrible vengeance on the German population. The sun had not yet risen, but in the darkness, the soldiers in Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front could see their breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. Comrades pulled up their collars to protect their necks and chins from the driving snow as they towed guns into position. There were bridgeheads all along the front at Baranov, 230 kilometers south of Warsaw, and the snow had been compressed by heavy artillery to create a slippery surface that caused problems for the soldiers in their clumsy army boots. It had been a long wait on the west side of the Vistula River, but now, in the early morning of 12th of January, the Red Army was ready to attack German positions. The Russian artillery was packed tightly along the front, with up to 300 guns per kilometer. At 4:35, the guns rained shells down on the German forces that were entrenched in 3 defensive lines, one behind the other. After half an hour's bombardment, the Soviet battalions stormed the German trenches, shooting anyone who survived the inferno. Specialist units scouted behind enemy lines to try and identify surviving strongholds. Their observations were sent directly back to Konev's artillery units, which targeted a new volley of shells directly at those positions. German officers were left in despair. "I began the operation with an understrength battalion," German battalion commander Reinhard Müller said later. "After the smoke of the Soviet preparation cleared, I had only a platoon of combat-effective soldiers left." As day dawned in his bunker on the Baranov front, Müller was aware that he and his countrymen on the Polish defense line would find it increasingly difficult to keep the Red Army at bay. The Russians had begun their onslaught against the German motherland, and the countdown to the Third Reich's collapse had begun. Stalin headed to the Oder River. The Russians had captured the bridgehead at Baranov back in the late summer of 1944, towards the end of Operation Bagration. The Red Army had expelled the Germans from Belarus and eastern Poland, and Russian soldiers had crossed the Vistula, Poland's largest river, at several points, seizing important bridgeheads south of Warsaw. Since Bagration, the front had remained relatively quiet, but German generals were in no doubt that it would not be long before the guns were rumbling again on the Eastern Front. Stalin, however, wanted to postpone the attack until the cold winter had frozen the ground like cement. This would allow Russian T-34 tanks to easily roll out to the Oder River and finally penetrate Germany. This meant that the so-called Vistula-Oder offensive could not kick off before January 1945. Until then, the Red Army would move their forces and equipment to the 3 bridgeheads on the Vistula.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?